I have spent most of my adult life nomming things. That is what a Zunabuttonus does at root. He arrives somewhere the charts are thin, he looks at what grows there and he gives it a designation, a clade, a classification, a place in the registry. The galaxy is large and disorganized and profoundly indifferent to order, so men like me make a career of imposing it. We note the color of a leaf membrane under polarized light. We log the tensile yield of a stem fiber. We assign a 6-character alphanumeric that tells any researcher anywhere what this thing is, where it belongs, and who found it first. I was good at it. I was good at it for 31 years. I left the field surveys at 52 because my knees disagreed with the crawling and my eyes disagreed with the close focus loop work, and because a former colleague named Ruva Strand, who had converted herself into a frontier medic somewhere in the process of getting older, told me that a station on the moon of Athra needed a second set of hands that knew biology. The pay was equivalent. The work was arguably more interesting. And Avathra was the kind of place that drew taxonomists the way a lamp draws insects, because the moon's deep forest harbored perhaps 30 or 40 living species that no one had properly catalogued, and the forest was not going anywhere. I want to be honest about my motives. I did not go to Vathula station to help people. I went because I was tired of ship corridors and because there were things growing in that forest that no one had yet named, and I have always found unnamed things more compelling than most of what passes for conversation. The medical work I treated as a secondary obligation. Ruva trained me on the triage protocols. I was competent. I did not freeze. But it was the forest that drew me. I want to say that plainly so that what happened later makes sense. Frontier Medical Station Vathula sat at the edge of the forest's first growth layer, not quite inside it, not quite clear of it. The trees on Avathra are not trees the way you might imagine them. They are tall, yes, and they have structures that function like trunks and structures that function like canopy, but the deep forest on that moon is more root than anything else. The surface soil is thin and pale, and underneath it runs a network of root fiber that some researchers have compared to a slow nervous system. The Avatha, the people of that forest, had developed alongside it over so many generations that the line between what was Avatha and what was root had become, in certain visible ways, unclear. The Avatha are a root people. That is the only designation that really fits. Their skin is the color of pale clay, a warm, dusty grey with a faint undertone of green where the light catches it, and under that skin, running in patterns specific to each individual, are filaments. Bioluminescent root filaments, thin as thread, that pulse with slow light when the Avatha are healthy and go dark when they are not. The filaments are not decorative. They are, as far as anyone has been able to determine, functional, tied into the individual's circulatory and lymphatic systems in ways that the existing medical literature does not fully understand. When an Avatha is frightened or ill, the filaments dim. When they are well and calm, they burn. In the children, the light tends toward copper and green, new growth colors. In the elders, it settles into something deeper, almost amber. I know all of this because I spent my first 4 months at Vathula documenting the Avatha biology more carefully than anyone had done before. Ruva let me, because it made me a better medic for the Avatha patients who came through, and because she was a practical woman who understood that giving me something to catalog kept me agreeable. The station itself was modest. One main tent, real walls, not canvas, but the compact called everything at the frontier a tent regardless, with a treatment bay, a worktable and documentation station, a basic laboratory bench and 2 cots for overnight patients. A separate staff quarters module behind it, where Ruva slept, and I had a narrow bunk that I used irregularly, preferring the treatment bay when the nights ran long. A supply annex. A cook who came 3 times a week and left meals in sealed containers, because feeding a frontier station was not a thing anyone wanted to build into a daily schedule. The forest 30 meters from the north wall, which was not far. Ruva had been at Vathula for 6 years when I arrived. She had the quality that field medics develop when they have been somewhere long enough, a comprehensive, unsentimental knowledge of the place and its people that functions as a second medicine. She knew which families in the nearby settlements had what histories. She knew which of the older Avatha patients trusted human medics and which did not, and she adjusted her manner accordingly. She knew the forest's edge in the way that people know things they have looked at every day for years, not with the taxonomist's formal knowledge, but with a residual bodily familiarity, the knowledge of someone who has breathed the air coming off it for a long time. We worked well together. I think this was because we were both, fundamentally, people who preferred to be doing something useful to talking about what we were doing, and we recognized this in each other and did not require any further social architecture. I found Luss on the 22nd day of my 5th month. She was in the intake trench, the shallow drainage channel that ran along the north side of the station's main tent, where the runoff from the forest edge collected after rain. We'd had rain the night before, a long, steady of-a-through rain that came in horizontal because the wind off the upper canopy pushed everything sideways. I went out before the morning shift started to check the trench for debris, a habit I'd developed after a clogged drain once flooded the equipment locker, and I nearly stepped on her. She was lying on her side in the mud at the trench's lowest point, small, her knees pulled up. Her eyes were open but not focused. Her filaments were almost entirely dark, just the faintest ghost of copper at her jaw and the base of her throat, pulsing very slowly, the way a lamp burns when the fuel is nearly gone. She was wearing what had once been a layered garment, pale fiber, forest-made, the kind the deep forest clades produce, but it was torn in several places and thoroughly soaked. She had been there for some hours. She smelled of rain and wet clay and something green and resinous that I later identified as a trauma response the Avatha body releases when the filament system begins to shut down. I did not think, that is the honest answer. I have been asked since whether I made some kind of decision in that moment, whether I weighed options, whether I thought about what I was taking on. I didn't. She was alive barely in the mud, and I picked her up and I carried her inside, and that was the entirety of my decision-making process. She weighed almost nothing. That is the detail I remember most clearly. She weighed almost nothing, and her head rested against my collarbone, and her filaments gave one slow pulse at my warmth, copper, just barely, and I carried her into the treatment bay and called for Ruva. Ruva stabilized her in under an hour. Dehydration, hypothermia by Avatha standards, and what Ruva called a filament cascade event, a systemic dimming caused by some combination of physical stress, isolation, and whatever had brought the child to our trench in the first place. We did not know. We put warmth back into her. We got fluids in by the slow route Ruva had learned was gentler for Avatha patients, and we waited. She woke up that afternoon. She did not speak that first day. Avatha children of her apparent age, and I say apparent because estimating ages without growth records is imprecise, and we were not equipped to be precise, are not without language, but they use it selectively, and she had no particular reason to trust us. She lay in the cot and she watched me with eyes the color of pale lichen, an unusual grug run I hadn't documented before, and she said nothing. And I sat at the work table and did my paperwork and left her alone, because that seemed like the correct thing to do. The second day, I put a bowl of broth near her. The third day, she took it. The fourth day, I was writing up a filament taxonomy note, and I looked over and she was standing at the window looking at the forest, and her filaments were burning a steady copper and green, and I thought, she is going to be all right. I filed the routine notification with the settlement registry that morning. Unknown Avatha juvenile, found, currently in medical care at Vathala Station. Any family or community representatives with a claim, please contact us. I filed it in good faith. I expected someone to come. No one came. I filed it again at the 2-week mark. Same result. I reached out directly to the 3 Orvathi settlement coordinators I knew, people who worked the community liaison work, and who would know whether anyone was looking for a lost child from the deep forest clades. 2 of them responded. Both said the same thing, in different ways. The deep forest clades were not registered with the settlement networks. Their children did not appear in the community records. If the child was from one of those clades, there was no formal mechanism through which they would make a claim, and no formal mechanism through which I could find them. I asked whether there were informal mechanisms. One coordinator said, carefully, that the deep forest clades did not typically interact with the settlement stations on matters involving their children. I understood what she was not saying. There was a history, on Orvath 3 and on other moons like it, of children from forest-edge communities being processed, was the word the old administrative language used. Processed by outside parties. The settlement networks had been built, in part, as a bulwark against that, but the deep forest clades had learned not to trust bulwarks that were made by the same world that had needed them, so they did not register. And when something happened to a child, they did not call the settlement stations. I sat with that for a while. In the meantime, Liz, I called her Liz, because she needed a name for the medical file and I had to call her something, and she neither confirmed nor denied it, which I took as permission, had begun to settle into the station in the way that children settle into places where they feel, cautiously, safe. She had a cot she treated as hers. She had a corner of the work table where she sat when I was writing. She had learned that the cook who came 3 times a week would leave a specific dish at the end of the table for her if she appeared before the midday meal. And she appeared before the midday meal with reliable precision. She watched everything. That was the thing I noticed first about her and kept noticing. Most children I had encountered in my sporadic and largely accidental dealings with children over the course of my life were loud. They moved through space decisively and narrated their experiences with enthusiasm. Liz was not like that. She moved quietly. She watched. She had a way of sitting very still and tracking a thing, a person moving across the tent, the rain on the canvas, a document I was reading with a quality of attention that felt less like curiosity and more like taxonomy. She was cataloging things. She was filing them somewhere. I recognized the behavior because it was mine. Her filaments by the 3rd week were burning steadily. Copper and green, with occasional threads of something I was going to call brass, a warm, reddish gold that appeared when she was concentrating. I had not seen that color combination documented before. I made careful notes. I told myself I was making them for the medical file. She spoke to me for the first time on the 23rd day after I'd found her. I was at the work table. It was late morning, the station quiet, Rava off on a supply run to the main compound. Liz had been sitting in her corner with something in her hands, a small object she'd carried with her since the trench that had survived somehow, that I had never looked at closely because it was hers, and I saw no reason to look at things that were hers without invitation. She set it on the table between us. It was a carved figure. Root wood, I thought, the same dense, resinous wood the deep forest clades used for tools and constructions, small enough to sit in a child's palm, shaped into something that might have been a person or might have been a tree or might have been both. The form was ambiguous in the way deep forest or Vathi carvings often were, as if the carver had declined to distinguish between the two. She said one word. I did not recognize it. It was from a deep forest dialect I had only fragmentary notes on. But the way she said it and the way she was looking at the figure told me it was a name. Someone's name. Someone she missed. I said, I'll keep it safe. I don't know whether she understood the words, but she looked at me for a moment with those pale lichen eyes, and then she took the figure back and closed her hands around it, and that was the end of that conversation. It was also, I recognized later, the beginning of something else. The Vithori recurrence arrived on the 31st day. There were 3 of them. They came in a ground transit vehicle from the direction of the eastern relay point, not from the forest, not from any settlement I knew of, but from the direction of the administrative corridor that ran between the moon's 2 main populated regions. They were tall. Vethori are tall in the way that things built for duration tend to be tall, not elegant, not imposing in a martial sense, but structured for longevity, for waiting. Their skin was the deep gray-brown of ancient stone. They wore documentation harnesses, the kind of vest or harness that carries physical certification documents, because the Vethori recurrence did not trust electronic records in a world where electronic records could be edited. This told me something. They asked, through the station's basic translation relay, for the xenobotanist medic presently holding an unclaimed Orvathi juvenile. I told them I was he. The one who spoke. I never learned their name. They did not offer it, told me they were representatives of the Vethori recurrence, a biological continuance authority with territorial charter over the deep forest regions of Orvath III's southern hemisphere. They had been informed through the settlement registry notification I had filed that an Orvathi juvenile with a specific filament pattern signature was currently in medical custody at Vethalar Station. They placed a document on my table. It was printed on heavy physical stock, another Vethori preference, physical documents, and it bore stamps I had not seen before but that had the correct structural markers of a legitimate writ. Biological continuance writ, it said. Species Renewal Protocol 7. The child, they did not call her Liz. They referred to her by a filament pattern code, was listed as a renewal cycle asset of the Vethori recurrence's deep forest territorial zone, registered under a biological continuance archive that the Vethori had maintained for, the document claimed, several hundred years. What the document said, translated into plain language, was this. The child's root filament pattern was logged in an old territorial archive as belonging to a specific forest renewal cycle, a Vethori practice in which Orvathi children with particular filament signatures were periodically absorbed back into the Vethori recurrence's territory to serve as what the document called biological continuance agents. The filaments, the document explained, carried genetic and biochemical information specific to the forest's renewal cycle. The Vethori recurrence needed them returned to complete the cycle. The child was, under Vethori recurrence law and under a territorial charter that predated the current Moon administration by approximately 300 years, their asset. I read the document twice. Then I looked up at the three of them standing in my station, in their documentation harnesses, waiting. I said, give me 48 hours to review this. They said the writ was current and valid, and did not require a review period. I said, you're in my medical station presenting a claim against a patient in my care. I'm invoking the Frontier Compact's medical custody provision, which gives me the right to 48 hours before any party may remove a patient from care for non-emergency purposes. If you disagree with that provision's applicability, I invite you to take it up with the Compact's arbitration office, which is located at the main compound approximately 90 minutes from here. They looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then they said they would return in 48 hours. When they left, I went and sat in the equipment locker, which was the only room in the station with a door, and I sat there for approximately 12 minutes. I have been told by people who know me that this is what I do when I am frightened. I go somewhere with a door. I sit. I do not pace. I find the floor and I sit on it and I breathe and I let the thing that is happening become real to me before I try to do anything about it. What was happening was this. There was a child in a cot 20 feet away who had survived something I did not know the details of, who had come to my station with her filaments nearly dark and her weight as close to nothing as a living person can be, who had, over 31 days, become the kind of quiet and watchful presence that a quiet and watchful person finds not comfortable exactly but right, correct. The way a term in a taxonomy is correct when it fits the thing it describes without forcing it. And there were 3 people outside who held a document that said she was a cycle asset, a biological continuance agent, a renewal resource. There was a document that said she was a thing. I sat in the equipment locker for 12 minutes and I breathed, and I let it become real. Then I got up and I called Riva. Riva was not one for sitting on floors and breathing. Riva was one for action. She arrived back from the main compound in what felt like considerably less than 90 minutes, and she read the writ while I made the coffee, and she said several words in her native language that I did not speak, but understood the register of perfectly. Then she said, "All right, let's take this apart. This is what I know about fighting bureaucratic documents from outside parties. The document is never the problem. The document is the face of the problem, and faces can be argued with, but the argument takes time and the time costs something. What you need, when someone presents you with a document that says a child is theirs, is not a better argument. What you need is time, obstruction, and a procedural foothold. Give the argument somewhere to stand." The Frontier Compact's medical custody provision was my 48 hours. I used those hours to find 3 more provisions. The first was the Species Protection Clause in the Compact's Welfare Annex, an old clause, inserted after a series of incidents involving non-consenting biological extraction from members of protected species, that required a welfare assessment before any biological continuance claim involving a living member of a protected species could be acted upon. The Orvathi were a protected species. The welfare assessment had to be conducted by a registered welfare arbiter. The arbiter had to be requested through the main compound. The main compound, I happen to know, had a processing backlog of approximately 6 days. The second was the Personal Medical Custodian Declaration under Compact Protocol 14. A treating medic could, in cases involving a patient of unknown community affiliation, formally declare medical custodianship, a legal status that gave the medic standing to challenge claims against the patient's person. It required 2 witnesses. Riva was one. The station cook, a taciturn woman named Olin who did not like paperwork but liked even less the look on my face when I asked her, was the other. The third was a jurisdictional challenge I pulled from a case precedent Riva found in the Compact's archived arbitration decisions. A case from 11 years prior involving a similar biological continuance claim in a different moon system, where the arbitrators had ruled that any territorial charter invoked in support of such a claim had to be verified against the current administrative map of the territory in question. The Vethori Recurrence's charter was 300 years old. The moon's administrative map had been revised several times since then. Whether the territory the charter described still corresponded to any legally recognized territory under the current map was a question I was now formally asking. I filed all 3 instruments before the 48 hours were up. I sent copies to the Compact's arbitration office. I sent copies to the main compound's administrative officer. I sent a copy, on Riva's suggestion, to a welfare advocacy organization that maintained a presence in the outer moon systems and had, by reputation, a particular interest in biological continuance claims of this nature. Then the Vethori came back. They were not pleased. They said the provisions I had invoked were obstructive. I said provisions existed to be invoked and I was invoking them. They said their charter was legitimate and their claim was valid. I said no one had disputed either point. I had asked for a welfare assessment and a territorial verification, which were standard procedural requirements, and if those requirements were an imposition, they were welcome to raise that concern with the arbitration office. They said they would wait. I said, there are benches on the south side of the station. They did not use the benches. They set up a ground transit camp at the edge of the approach track and they waited, and for the next 6 days I worked around them the way you work around a thing that is present and unpleasant and cannot currently be moved. I treated my patients. I wrote my filament taxonomy notes. I filed follow-up documents when the arbitration office requested them, which was twice. I ate my meals. There is a specific quality to waiting under that kind of pressure. I had not experienced it before, not precisely. I had waited for arbitration rulings in my research career, for permits, for classification reviews, for the slow gears of the frontier administration to complete their rotations. But waiting with stakes is different from waiting with paperwork. Waiting with stakes has a weight that sits between your shoulder blades and does not move, and you either learn to function with it or you don't. I functioned. I made a point of going about my days in the exact rhythm I had maintained before the Vethori arrived. Morning check of the trench, which was habit now and which I was not going to abandon because 3 people were camped at the end of the approach track. Documentation in the morning. Patient consultations as they arose. Filament taxonomy work in the afternoon, when the light through the east-facing window was best for the close work. Meals. The evening hour at the work table with Liz, which was the one thing I would not have described as habit. It was too specific for that, too located, but it had become part of the day's architecture, and I had no intention of removing it. I spoke to the Vethori representatives twice during the waiting period. Both times they came to the station door and asked for an update on the arbitration timeline. Both times I told them the timeline was in the arbitration office's hands and not mine, and that I would inform them when I received a ruling. Both times they went back to their camp. On the third day, a second Vethori vehicle arrived. 4 more representatives, also in documentation harnesses, also carrying physical document cases. They set up next to the first group. I counted them from the window and decided I did not need to do anything about this and went back to my work. Rivat, who was more inclined than I was toward direct confrontation, went out on the 4th day and asked them whether they required anything from the station. Medical supplies, water, anything within the purview of a frontier medical station. This was, I recognized, less an offer of hospitality and more a performance of a specific kind of confidence. The confidence of someone who has done the paperwork correctly and is not afraid of the people who are waiting. The Vethori representatives said they did not require anything. Rivat thanked them for their time and came back inside and said to me, 4 new ones. I said, I know. She said, they're not here to be comfortable. I said, no. She looked at me for a moment, then she went back to her side of the tent. Liz watched the Vethori from the window. She did not ask me what they were. She did not ask me what was happening. I don't know how much she understood. She had been listening to the station's translation relay long enough to have picked up some working vocabulary, but I could not be sure what she had understood from the exchanges with the Vethori representatives, which had been conducted in a formal register that was hard even for fluent speakers. I think she understood more than I gave her credit for. She was Orvathi, and the Orvathi had lived adjacent to entities like the Vethori recurrence for a long time. What I know is that she watched them with the same quality of attention she gave everything. And I know that on the 4th day of the waiting period, she sat down at the work table across from me, and she placed the carved figure between us, and she looked at me, and then she looked at the figure, and then she looked back at me. I looked at the figure for a moment, then I slid it back across the table to her. She held it. I went back to my work. I want to be precise about something. I am not a sentimental person. I was not in those weeks under any illusion that I was performing some noble act. I was not thinking about legacy or sacrifice or the beautiful fragility of an alien child's trust. I was thinking about a document and a procedural defect I hoped I had correctly identified, and about whether the arbitration office was going to move fast enough, and about whether the Vethori recurrence had more instruments in reserve that I hadn't anticipated. I was thinking practically, which is the only way I know how to think. But I knew, in the way you know things that are not comfortable to articulate, that the practical thinking was not the whole of it. I had been nomming things for 31 years. I knew the difference between a thing that was named correctly and a thing that was named wrong. The Vethori's document named Liz wrong. She was not an asset. She was not a cycle yield. She was not a biological continuance resource. Whatever she was, and she was something I had not fully cataloged, something I was still in the early stages of understanding. She was not that. The name was wrong, and I had spent my entire professional life refusing to apply names that were wrong to things that were alive. That is the entirety of my motivation. I am not sure it is a better motivation than sentiment. I think it might be a more durable one. On the sixth day, the welfare arbiter arrived from the main compound. She was a small woman named Olin, no relation to our cook, or if there was a relation, neither of them mentioned it, and she had the particular quality of unhurried thoroughness that good arbiters develop, which is the quality of someone who has been lied to by documents many times and has learned not to be impressed by them. She reviewed everything. She spoke to me. She spoke to Rava. She attempted to speak to Liz through the translation relay, and she spent 45 minutes reviewing the Vethori recurrences writ, while the Vethori representatives sat in my tent and radiated what I can only describe as formal displeasure. Then she did the territorial verification I had requested. The Vethori recurrences charter had been issued 312 years ago under a territorial designation called the Southern Deep Forest Provisional Zone. She compared that designation against the current administrative map and against the intermediate maps produced at each of the moon's 4 administrative reclassifications since the charter's issuance. The Southern Deep Forest Provisional Zone had ceased to exist as a legal territorial designation 67 years ago, when Orvath III's administration had been restructured under the Frontier Compact's standard moon governance protocols. The zone had been reclassified, divided, and redistributed among 3 other administrative units. The Vethori recurrence had continued to use the old designation in its internal documents, but it had never registered its territorial charter with the new administrative structure. The biological continuance writ had been issued under a territorial designation that no longer legally existed. Olin looked up from the documents and looked at the Vethori representatives and said, in the measured tone of someone delivering a finding they have arrived at through evidence and are not going to argue about, that the writ was invalid. The territorial charter underlying it had lapsed under reclassification. The biological continuance claim had no legal standing. The welfare assessment found no basis for removal of the patient from medical custody. The medical custodian declaration filed by the treating medic remained in effect. She said it carefully, and she said it completely, and then she set the documents down and she waited. The Vethori representatives did not move for a moment. Then the one who had done all the speaking produced a second document from their harness, a formal objection to the ruling, pre-prepared, I noted, which meant they had anticipated this outcome and had brought a counter-instrument. I was not surprised. I had been expecting a counter-instrument since the 4th day. Olin received the objection. She read it. She said that the objection would be logged with the arbitration office and processed through standard channels, which would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks. In the meantime, her ruling stood, and the patient remained in medical custody at Vethalar Station. She said it in the same measured tone. The Vethori representatives gathered their documentation harnesses. They looked at me. I am not sure what they were looking for in my face. I kept it neutral. They left. Olin stayed for another 2 hours to complete her paperwork. Before she went, she came and stood near me at the work table, and she said, not looking at me but looking at the window where the forest sat gray-green and rain-wet and enormous, "The objection will fail. The territorial lapse is unambiguous, but it will take time." I said I understood. She said, "What will you do with her in the meantime?" I said I would keep her here, in medical custody, until the objection was resolved. And after that, I would work with the settlement coordinators to see whether any appropriate community could be identified. And if not, I would continue as her custodian until some better arrangement was found. Olin nodded once slowly and left. That night I sat at the work table after Rava had gone to the staff quarters, and the cook had gone home, and the station was quiet. Liz was asleep in her cot, her filaments burning copper and green in the dark. a slow pulse that I had learned to find steadying without being able to explain why. I wrote up my formal objection response in anticipation of whatever the Vethori recurrence's counterinstrument would require. I documented the day's proceedings. I filed a preliminary welfare follow-up with the main compound, as procedure required. Then I sat for a while and looked at the forest through the window. I have tried in the time since to understand what I was in those weeks. Not what I was doing, that part is straightforward. I was filing documents and holding a legal line, but what I was to her. The closest I can get is this. I was a fixed point. I was a thing that did not move. The station was a specific space at a specific location, and I was the person in the station, and the person in the station did not change his position on the question of who she was. That seems simple, but I have come to think that for a child who had been through whatever she had been through before the trench, a fixed point that held its position was not nothing. I am not sure she needed me to be more than that. I am not sure that she needed me specifically, that any medic in any station who had done what Reva and I did would not have served the same function. The fixed point could have been anyone. It was me, because I was the one who went to check the trench that morning, but the function was not mine because I was suited to it. It was mine because I happened to be there. I sit with that. It does not diminish anything I feel about it. The galaxy is large, and most of what happens in it happens by adjacency rather than design, and I have never found that accidental proximity makes a thing less real. I thought about the thing Turith Olin had said, "What will you do with her?" and I tried to answer it honestly. The honest answer was that I did not know. I was a xenobotanist and a field medic. I was 59 years old, and I lived in a tent at the edge of a forest on a moon that was not my home, and had never been anyone's home in the conventional sense. I had no particular gift for the raising of children, alien or otherwise. I had, in my life, formed attachments to organisms I was studying with the kind of careful, professional interest that is not exactly love, but that is not nothing either. I had mourned quietly when specimens died. I had felt, when I made a correct identification, a satisfaction that I can only describe as recognition, the feeling of a thing clicking into the right place, named correctly at last. I looked at Lys's filaments in the dark. I thought, I do not know what will happen. I thought, I know what I will do if the Vethori come back. I thought, that is enough to know for now. I slept on the cot I kept in the treatment bay, as I had been doing since the Vethori arrived, in case of need in the night, and I slept adequately, which for me has always been the correct measure. The days after that had a quality I am not sure I can accurately describe. There was the ordinary work of the station, patience, documents, Reva's gruff and competent presence, the cook's reliable meals. There was the ongoing paperwork of the arbitration process, which generated correspondence every 3 or 4 days and which I answered promptly. There was the forest, which was always there, and which I had begun, in odd moments, to observe through Lys's window watching rather than through my own. She was teaching me things about the forest that I had not known. Not deliberately, she was not a teacher, not in any formal sense, but in the way that close observation of an observant thing teaches you. She noticed things I would have walked past. She watched the root surface of the forest floor, visible from the window, with a quality of attention that seemed different from the attention she gave everything else. More interior, as if she were not just watching but listening, as if the root system she had grown up alongside were saying something, and she were trying to hear it from this distance. Once, about 2 weeks after Turith Olin's visit, I sat at the window next to her and looked at what she was looking at. The morning light came through the outer canopy layer at an angle that lit the soil a particular warm gold, and where the roots surfaced, and they did surface, here and there, in loops and arcs like enormous stitches in the ground, they caught the light and threw it back in threads of amber and copper. Her filaments at that moment matched the roots almost exactly, copper and green with threads of brass. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. We sat at the window and looked at the forest together, and I thought about the taxonomy note I had been writing about her filament colors, and then I thought, no, not everything needs a note. It was around that time that she began to spend more time near the perimeter of the station. Not outside, not yet, but near the door, near the window, in the spaces where inside and outside blurred. She was not restless. It was not like watching something caged. It was more like watching something that was remembering the shape of a place it had always been going back to, and was beginning to feel the pull of it. I registered this. I let it register. I did not try to name it. The formal resolution came on the 42nd day after the Vethori's initial visit. The arbitration office sent the ruling by high-priority relay. The Vethori recurrence's objection had been reviewed and rejected. The territorial lapse finding was confirmed. The biological continuance writ was invalid. The recurrence had no enforceable claim. The medical custodian declaration remained in effect until modified by further agreement. Case closed. I read the ruling at the work table. Reva read it over my shoulder. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh and was probably both. She put her hand briefly on my shoulder. Reva was not a touching person, so the gesture meant something, and then she went back to her side of the tent. I relayed the ruling to the Vethori recurrence's administrative contact through official channels, as required. I received an acknowledgement that contained no further comment. I forwarded everything to the Welfare Advocacy Organization, which had been monitoring the case. I updated the medical file. I did the paperwork correctly and completely, because the paperwork was the thing that held. That evening, Liz sat across from me at the work table for what I had come to think of as her hour. The time between the evening meal and sleep when she sat nearby and I worked, and we existed in the same space without demanding anything of each other. She had the carved figure in her hands, turning it slowly. She put it on the table between us. She looked at me. I looked at the figure. Then I looked at her. Her filaments were burning the brightest I had ever seen them, copper and green and brass, all of it lit, like new growth after rain, like a root system waking in spring. Her eyes were on mine, pale lichen, steady. She pushed the figure across the table toward me. I did not pick it up immediately. I sat with what she was doing, with what the gesture meant, insofar as I understood it, which was not completely. Then I picked it up. It was warm from her hands. I turned it over once, feeling the resinous density of the root wood, the slight irregularity of the carving where the form declined to be fully one thing or the other. I held it. She watched me hold it. Then she nodded once, very slightly, in a way that might have meant something specific in her clade's vocabulary, and might have meant something more general, and she got up and went to her cot and lay down, and her filaments pulsed slow and steady and bright in the dark. I sat at the table for a long time. I do not know when she decided. I do not know how long she had been deciding. I know that she was an observant thing, a careful thing, a thing that watched and catalogued and filed, and that she had been doing those things for 7 weeks in my station with the forest 30 meters away, and that some things grow toward what they need the way roots grow toward water. Not because they are told to, not because it is the logical next step, but because the direction is in them and they have always been going there. She was gone before dawn. I know this because I sleep lightly, as I have all my adult life, and I heard the sound of the door. A careful sound. She did not rush. She did not flee. The door opened and closed with the deliberate quiet of a person who does not want to wake anyone but is not, either, ashamed of what they are doing. I lay in my cot in the treatment bay and I listened to the sound, and I did not get up. I want to be honest about that too. I thought about getting up. The thought was there, the instinct to check, to follow, to make sure. But I lay in the cot and I thought about what she had looked like at the window, watching the roots surface in the morning light. I thought about the way her filaments had matched the color of them. I thought about the carved figure, which was now on my work table where she had put it, and about what it meant that she had put it there and not taken it with her. She was not running from something. She was returning to something. and she had given me the one object she had carried through whatever she had survived before the trench, and the giving of it was not the act of someone in distress. It was the act of someone who had decided carefully that it was safe to leave it here, that it would be kept, that I would keep it. I lay in my cot and let her go. When dawn came, I went and stood at the window. The forest was the forest, pale in the early light, enormous, root-surfaced and vast and full of things I had not named. The roots that surfaced along the forest floor caught the first light the way they always did, copper and amber and warm, threading the pale soil with color. I looked at it for a long time. I did not go in after her. I noticed, standing at that window, that I had stopped thinking of the forest as a subject for taxonomy. I am not sure when this happened. Sometime in the weeks of watching it alongside her, I had stopped seeing it as a collection of organisms to be named and started seeing it as a place, a specific, whole, unreducible place, the way any place becomes once you have stood in it long enough with someone who belongs to it. The distinction matters to me. It represents something that changed, and I want to note it accurately. I told Reva. Reva said several words in her native language and then said, "Do you think she's all right?" I said I thought she knew where she was going. Reva was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Yeah." We filed the appropriate documentation. Unknown Orvathi juvenile, previously in medical custody at Vethalar Station, has left of her own volition. Medical custodianship status updated. I wrote it as accurately as I could. I noted the filament pattern code in the case record for completeness. I noted her physical condition at departure, excellent, which was accurate. She had been well for weeks. I noted that departure appeared voluntary and purposeful. I put the carved figure on my work table. I did not catalog it. I did not write a note about it. I left it there, next to the field loop and the stack of filament taxonomy notes, and it stayed there for the remaining 2 years of my posting at Vethalar Station. And when I packed out, I put it in my kit and I took it with me, and it has been on my desk at every posting since. In the days between the ruling and her departure, she changed in a way I am not sure I can accurately describe without sounding like I am making more of it than it was. Her filaments had always been bright by that point. The dimming of the trench was long past, but there was, in those final days, an additional quality to the light they threw. Less like a thing burning steadily, more like a thing preparing to move. I am aware this may be retrospective impression, a quality I am attributing to a memory that I have revisited many times and that has, over time, taken on more shape than it had in the original experience. I note this honestly, and I leave the observation standing anyway, because honesty about the limits of my perception does not mean the perception was wrong. She spoke to me more in those last days than she had in all the weeks prior. Not much more. She was not, would not ever be, I think, a talkative person, but she asked questions. Small ones. In the fragmentary version of the translation relays vocabulary that we had both learned to navigate, where certain tools went when they were not in use, how I had come to Vethalar, whether I had been in forests before. I told her I had been in many forests, on many worlds. She listened to this with her cataloging attention. She asked once whether the forest near the station was the same as the forests I had been in before. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Then I said, "No, this forest is different. The roots go deeper here. I haven't fully understood it yet." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at the window, and then she looked back at me, and there was something in her expression, not a smile exactly, but something in the vicinity of one, a recognition. I did not try to name it, I just held it. The welfare advocacy organization contacted me 4 months after Liz left. They were following up on the case, standard procedure after a resolution. I answered their questions. They said, at the end of the exchange, that they had received an unconfirmed report from a settlement coordinator on the moon's western edge about a child matching the filament pattern signature from the Vethalar case. The report was vague. It said that a small Orvathi child with unusual filament colors, copper, and green, and a color the coordinator described as warm gold, had emerged from the deep forest near the settlement's water station with a group of adults who appeared to be from the deep forest clades. The adults had spoken briefly with the coordinator about water access and had moved on. The child had been with them. She had appeared well. The coordinator had not gotten close enough to confirm the filament pattern. The sighting had not been verified. The advocacy organization was not able to establish whether it was her. I thanked them for the information. I did not know whether to believe it. I still do not know. It is the kind of report that could be true or could be the well-meaning shaping of ambiguous evidence into a story that is easier to sit with than not knowing. I am a scientist. I understand the difference between a confirmed identification and a probable one. I have spent my professional life not claiming the one when I only had the other. What I know confirmed. A child was in my station for 7 weeks. Her filaments went from nearly dark to burning bright. She left on her own terms. She left something of hers in my care. What I suspect but cannot confirm. She had known, all along, roughly where her people were. She had been in the deep forest, and she had gotten separated or injured or both, and she had ended up in the trench, and I had found her. And what she had needed from me was not permanent shelter but time to recover, time to be strong enough, time to wait out whatever danger had separated her from her clade. The waiting period the Vethori forced, which had felt like a siege, might have been, from her perspective, a further extension of the time she was already using. She had watched the forest every day. She had watched it with the attention of someone listening. And when the ruling came through and the threat was lifted and she was strong and the time was right, she had pushed the carved figure across the table and she had walked out the door and she had gone home. I cannot verify this. I will never be able to verify it. The deep forest clades do not register with the settlement networks, and I cannot find them, and I would not go looking for them if I could, because going looking for them would be exactly the kind of thing I refused to do the first time, and I see no reason to revise that position. I keep the carved figure on my desk. It is the color of old amber now. The resin has darkened with age and handling, the way resin does. The form is still ambiguous, person or tree or both. I have looked at it many times and I have not resolved the question, and I think the carver would be satisfied by that. I think the carver was someone who understood that some things decline to be fully one thing or the other, and that the correct response to that is not to force a resolution, but to hold the ambiguity without flinching. I am not, as I said, a sentimental person. I do not think what I did was extraordinary. I found a child. I filed the paperwork. I held a line that seemed obvious to me to hold. That is the complete account of my actions, and I would have done the same for any patient in my care, regardless of species, regardless of what documents were presented to me, regardless of how long the Vethori were willing to sit outside in their ground transit camp and wait. But I am aware that the world does not always work that way. I am aware that I was, for those weeks, the specific thing that stood between her and a document that said she was a resource. I am aware that the document was not aberrant. It was the product of a system that had been producing that kind of document for 300 years and would produce more of them, and that the procedural defect Tureth Olen found was one thread in a much larger fabric that no one arbitration ruling was going to unravel. I know this. I am not under any illusion that the case was a victory in any large sense. It was a victory in one case, for one child, in one station on one moon. The system that produced the writ is still running. The Vethori Recurrence filed a revised charter application 3 months after the ruling, with updated territorial maps, and whether that application was approved, I genuinely do not know. What I know is, she walked out of that door in the direction of the forest, and she was free, and she had chosen it. There is a particular feeling, I have no precise name for it, that comes when a classification is correct. When you have looked at a thing long enough, when you have gathered the right evidence, when you have considered the options carefully and honestly, and you arrive at the name that fits the thing without distortion and without force. The thing clicks into place. The taxonomy is right. I felt that, sitting at the window in the dawn light, watching the forest that had taken her back. I do not know what she is. I have a fragment of a filament taxonomy note and a case file that is formally closed and a carved figure on my desk. I have the memory of copper and green light in the dark, pulsing slow and steady. I have the sound of a door opened carefully by someone who was not fleeing and was not afraid. I have the weight of her, almost nothing, when I carried her in from the trench. That is the record as I have it. I have been asked whether I regret not doing more, whether I should have gone after her, tracked her, ensured the outcome I had imagined for her. I do not regret it. Going after her would have made her safety contingent on my choices, and her safety was hers. I held the door open as long as it needed to be held. I kept what she left with me. When she was ready, she left, and the direction she went was hers alone. The carved figure sits on my desk, person or tree or both. I have not tried to resolve it.